All right. Ms. Legalista here, aka Attorney Sheila, and I am back and interested in Jussie Smollett. I tell you, the fact that his appeal has now been filed by his attorney and that there's this new docu series is being put out by Fox, I think has renewed some interest. And of course, it's been a year. Now, this all happened in 2019. I don't know if you've had a chance to check out the first episode of this docu-series, but I do want to talk about it a little bit. And I actually have my first comment that was posted earlier today. And let's see what Tim Hansen says here. He says he is guilty, and the fact that he is still lying about it and is trying to get away is angering people. It's difficult when you have people who have legitimate threats placed against them, people who actually go through something, and then you have a person who has not just been charged but has been found guilty. Now, in his case, the way they set up filing a false police report is under disorderly conduct. So technically, he was charged and found guilty of disorderly conduct for filing these false police reports for assault, battery, something like that. But in any case, it's upsetting to people who have actually been in a situation where this has actually occurred to them. And to now see this person out here still proclaiming innocence. Like I said, his attorney just filing this month an appeal of that conviction. I don't know how many people remember this case. This actually happened back in 2019, but I want to talk a little bit about this first episode. And I should have written down what the first episode was called, but this docu-series is being put out by Fox Nation. I'm not sure how many episodes there are. I think it's a 5-part docu-series, but it's being put out by Fox Nation, and I couldn't help but watch it. Hello, Mr. Lucky. How are you doing this afternoon? Thank you for joining us as we talk about this case and the fact that it's still around. You know, people will typically file appeals of convictions, but there was an interesting part in this docu series when it first started. They show this court scene where he is walking out of the court in this sort of defiant pose, and he's saying something like, I'm still innocent, I'm still claiming my innocence. Very interesting, because now here it is, 2023. This happened in 2019, and I don't know, do people still think that he was innocent and that he did not plan this? Okay, let me go to some of the things that were in this docu-series, because even though I followed some of this at the time, it's definitely a few years later. And yes, I have forgotten about some of this, and maybe some of you have too. You have the two brothers, and I call them the brothers. They, here's this thing. There are always people in a story, whatever the story is, who are characters themselves. In this case, I say that about the brothers. Mr. Smollett aside, the brothers are almost, the supporting actors in this whole docu-series, because without them, this would not have taken place. And yet, even in this docu-series, they come across as people who have their own story. And it looked like at the end of this first episode that maybe their mother is also going to make some future appearances in some of these episodes. But the brothers started out by talking about, taking place in this incident and picking up their $500. And I just remember thinking, I hope they were getting more than $500. But it turns out that there was a $3,500 check that they had already received. And then I guess after the incident, this is what it sounds like. After the incident, they were supposed to be picking up their remaining $500 that was due. And they talked about having things going on in their lives. They felt like they were moving forward, things were taking off for them. They were going to go to Nigeria to participate in, I think it was a show, and it was supposed to be a really big show in Nigeria. And so they felt like their careers were taking off. And think about it, they were now or getting ready to be participants in one of the biggest shows, even though it's a hoax, one of the biggest shows that had been out there, and that was this assault of Jussie Smollett that Mr. Smollett had put out there. So you have the brothers, and their names are in the episode, but they also call them Bola and Ola. I guess those were their nicknames or shorter names or something like that. But they were talking about how when it was over, they went back to working out, and they showed some great pictures of them. They went back to working out, to working on their career, and they felt really good. But on the plane ride back, I think it was Ola, it was one of them, I can't remember, who was talking about how he just felt like they knew that they had done, that the police knew, law enforcement knew, and they were coming after them. They were going to be ready there at the airport to pick them up. The other brother was just like, no, I think we're good. But remember, the whole time they were in Nigeria, there was all of this information that was being released about them. So the brothers get off the plane, and yes, they get pulled to the side after their passports are checked. And at that point, they're having to go before police and answer questions. But the brothers are worth watching and listening to. But here is the other thing about this particular episode. It was this interesting play between law enforcement and the press, and how law enforcement used the press to get information out about the case that they didn't want to take ownership of. So, in a way, you had the law enforcement team, some members of it, according to this episode, that were feeding little bits of information to the press. So there's one press person who is in this episode who talks about having this conversation and saying, okay, so, what is going on with this case? And the law enforcement officer gives a statement, something to the extent of, well, we're investigating, but we're skeptical. Well, that's a full indication of where they think this case is going. Now, think about it, because here are a few things that sort of came up as you listen to this. Now, I've been in Chicago. I've never been in Chicago in the winter. I have no desire to go to Chicago in the winter. I have heard of how cold it is in Chicago in the winter. And they say that this was one of the coldest nights of the year when this happened, and that nobody in their right mind is going to be hanging out for very long at 2 a.m. in the morning waiting to attack somebody else. That this just really didn't make sense. And so you have the police using the press to sort of put these little nuggets out there about the fact that they don't think this story is real. They see all kinds of holes in it from the get-go, and yeah, they just didn't see it was going anywhere. So there's this piece about the cold. There is this piece about, law enforcement giving the press tidbits and shaping public opinion to a tiny, tiny, tiny extent. Because here's what one of the members of the press had to say during this episode. He talked about, or maybe it wasn't even a member of the press, but it was another person who was speaking during the episode. And he talked about the fact that when you have white liberal media, the last thing that they want to do is make comments that make it look like they don't support where a person has been maybe harassed or beaten, and where there may be some sort of racial violence involved. They're really concerned about going out on a limb and saying, hey, this didn't happen. This doesn't make sense. Even the police are skeptical. And so this press person in this episode talks about how much hate mail he got after tweeting what law enforcement told him, which was, we're saying that, hey, we're law enforcement, we're investigating, but we're skeptical. They jumped on the press guy for saying what law enforcement told them. So law enforcement wasn't going out on a limb itself. It was sort of using the press to put this information out there. But it just wasn't getting picked up because it was not something people were yet ready to believe. And so instead, what do you do when you don't like the message? When you don't like the message, you shoot the messenger. And that's essentially what they did. He said he got all kinds of hate mail. And of course, in this episode, they show some of the hate mail that he got, some of the things that people were saying to him, all kinds of names that they were calling him, not because of a statement he himself made about the incident, but because he reported what law enforcement told him. So this is all very interesting. So this sort of relationship between law enforcement there, between the Chicago Police Department and the press. And here's the other thing. There's just this one press guy mostly who's doing the talking. But the thing about it is he then makes it sound like he wasn't the only press person that law enforcement was talking to, that there were also other people that they were giving little nuggets of info to. So again, law enforcement doesn't sound like it's ready to be out there and to take responsibility of the position that it really already has. And we hear this sometimes in criminal cases. You'll hear, especially when it's the defendant, they'll say, law enforcement already had their minds made up, that they didn't even go looking for another suspect because they had decided from day one that you were the primary and that they were just going to go after you. So this is nothing new. We're used to hearing that statement. But this sort of idea that they weren't just telling it to this one friend, press person that they knew, but that they were multiple people that they were sending out messaging to, it gives you some idea of the relationships that get built in even bigger cities. Now, we sort of expect this in a small town, right? Where everybody knows everybody else. People are related to each other. They've worked with each other. They've gone to school with each other. On Sundays, they're in church with each other. And so the relationships are really tight. The families have been there for generations. But in a bigger city like Chicago, that was another thing they talked about in this episode. Everybody knows each other. The attorneys know the police officers, who know the members of the press, who know the attorneys. Of course, they're always calling around for information. On the press side, they're on the police officer side, on the law enforcement side, they're sharing information. Who do you think they're sharing that information to when they say, press release? Or nowadays, they just post it up on social media in addition to issuing a press release. They have public information officers. So yes, this is a two-way street. And it was very obvious in this episode that law enforcement knew what they could do with that two-way street. Toward the end of this particular episode, there was this piece where there was a journalist from the Washington Post who talked about actually finding the bottle, which was supposedly this evidence with the sauce and the bleach in it. Now, somehow this got missed for quite a while. So there's the incident. You take it that police, walked around the scene, but she was able to find this bottle and then call law enforcement back up and have them come back out, and they got it. So it's interesting, that context too, that in the midst of them doing their investigation, that somehow this got missed. Because then in the back of other people's minds, they're saying, well, what else did you miss? Again, you're focusing on him. You've already said you're skeptical. Maybe you've missed some other things. So I think overall in watching this, it was very interesting. So let me know if you've been watching this. Let me know if you think this was a hoax. And let me see what kind of comments we have coming in. Linda McMillan says, thanks for the update. Yeah, I still think this part where you have someone that is still saying I'm innocent, later. Now think about it, because I think he had to serve like maybe 150 days, 120 days, something like that, and he had to pay restitution and a fine. So he didn't get that much time because it's disorderly conduct. It's administrative in terms of the fact that he filed a false police report. He had police coming out and he's giving false information. It's not a circumstance where he hurt someone else. He, in fact, was the party who set himself up to be hurt. So the whole thing was just very strange. And you sit back and you wonder, because one of the questions people always have, why? Why would you do this? Why would you do this? They did show a little piece of the interview that he did for and I was it Robin Roberts? I think maybe it was Robin Roberts. And he looks so calm and collected, which is great. But when you go back and look at that interview now, in light of him having been charged and convicted, it's interesting to think that this was a person who played that role, that I'm a victim, for a very long time and is still playing that role. In this episode, there was, I want to call him a promoter because I don't remember exactly what he did. But apparently one evening there was supposed to be this event, and of course, this was after he had been assaulted and gone through that experience. There was supposed to be this event. Mr. Smollett was supposed to appear there. And the guy said he looked out the window and saw this line of people waiting to come in. And he was just astounded, amazed, I guess, because they had never had that many people there. And they were all there to support Jussie. Everything had been in the news by this point. People were wanting to lift him up, wanting to let him know that they were there for him, that we weren't going to take this as a city or as a country lying down, that we were going to stand up for righteousness. And they were coming out to support him and to hear him. The promoter, I keep calling him a promoter because I don't remember what he said he did exactly, but he talked about how at the end of Jussie's performance, he made this comment. He made a series of comments that just left him thinking, no, this didn't happen. By that point, he was like, no, 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 no way, no way. And at the end, I think the very last segment of that they play in the episode is Jussie Smollett calling himself the gay Tupac Shakur or something like that. And the producer or promoter was sort of like, nobody does that. If you've ever been beaten, you've been in a situation where you've gone through something like that, and you felt your life was threatened and on the line, you didn't know what was going to happen to you, the last thing you're going to do is be at some event sort of puffing yourself up. Now, I don't know. I might take issue with that because people behave in all kinds of ways when they've gone through trauma. Everybody handles trauma differently. So I hesitate to say that his reaction to that was an indication of his guilt. I might say it was strange. It might be totally unexpected. Was it an indication of his guilt? I don't know. I don't know. But the idea that he was performing and that he was out there, for some people, it's, I want to get back on forward with my life. I want to move forward. But other people, yeah, it's going to take some time. But this sort of idea that he used that to sort of say, and I fought back. That was one of the things that they showed him saying in this production. It was just very interesting because at this point, people are sort of looking at this and saying, okay, we're a year later, you filed an appeal. It just does not sound like you have grasped the concept that nobody really believes you. Nobody believes you. It was the coldest night in Chicago. We really can't get past that part. And then on top of that, there's video later showing you afterward with your sandwich. So you're walking down the street with your sandwich. with this rope still around your head or your neck or something like that. So all of these pieces just don't fit together. Even now in 2023, when we go back to look at them, they make absolutely no sense whatsoever. You let me know if you think otherwise and if you've started to look at any of these episodes, but it just makes no sense. Now, here's another thing I want to talk about that I thought was really interesting because they said, or he said, Mr. Smollett said, when he gave one of his reports about who he was attacked by, he said it was two white men. Had the MAGA hat. Here's what they said. Now, it might be 2 a.m. in the morning. It might be really, really cold. You might be really, really hungry because you've gotten a sandwich, but you haven't eaten it yet. But I find it really hard to believe that you would confuse two black men for two white men. And I think the first thing he said was maybe it was one white man or something like that. But then they're two men together. It just doesn't seem like you would get that wrong. If they're in your face, they're beating you, so you're looking at them. And it's not like he said, well, maybe they were light-skinned black dudes or something like that. The indication in the episode is that he said they were white, and yet we have the brothers. So all of this, even today, still makes no sense. And the fact that he continues to proclaim his innocence, I think, you have to wonder, are you just looking for more? I don't know, is it popularity? Because at this point, it's not popularity that you're getting. It's, at this point, you're infamous. People don't really want to hire you for a whole bunch of acting gigs now. Maybe they do. I don't know. You guys can tell me in the comments. Is he acting? Is he still acting? Does he still have an agent? What has he been doing since he's gotten out? Is this part of him resurrecting his career? I don't know, because the first thing that somebody's going to be thinking if they're thinking about hiring him is, oh, well, he just filed an appeal. So he still thinks that this is a legitimate claim that he has, even though he's been convicted, and most people now believe that it was a hoax. So if he's still believing that, would you work with him? Would you hire him? Or would you start to ask yourself, maybe it's time for some self-reflection, Mr. Mullet? Maybe there's something else you should be focusing on for a little while. I don't know. You let me know if you're still watching him, keeping up with him, if you've seen him in any shows. Now, as far as Empire, remember when this happened, that was probably the biggest piece I remembered about this was this whole sort of thing with the show and the pandemic, and then them sort of wrapping the season up because of both of those. It's sort of like, what do we do with this show now? We're going to carry his contract for another year, but we aren't really going to use him because we can't really use him in the show, because that might give an indication that we're okay with what happened and we don't want to do that. So we're just going to keep him under contract, but we aren't going to have him actually acting in the show. Now we have the pandemic on top of that, and it's really hard to bring the crew back and to have them working. And so now we're shutting everything down. It was like its own cold vortex. So there was the vortex the night of the incident, this polar vortex, because it's so cold. And then you had this whole incident with the actual show where it then got canceled and was no longer in production. I mean, think about that. You're part of the crew, you worked with this person, and you're now asking yourself, what in the world? How did they feel about this? Because their lives changed as a result too. And it was twofold, not just what happened with him, but also because of the pandemic. But you have to think that maybe if this hadn't happened with him and the show, the producers not really knowing how to move forward with that, because you're thinking, oh, well, gosh, well, we've got to stand with him and then you go, oh, well, maybe this is not real. Maybe this is not true. What do we do now? I would hate to be in that predicament. And now, 2023, like I said before, he's still proclaiming his innocence. Do you believe him? Let me know if you believe him. But that was episode number 1. And I'll be talking about the other episodes too, just making sure that we're going through some of the issues here that sort of popped up. We've talked about this relationship between the press and law enforcement. There was this other thing that I wanted to mention too, and that was this sort of idea that they were looking at the video. This is law enforcement saying, we looked at the video, and that was another thing. The 2 men, we found this video, the 2 men in the area, after the scene, before the scene, whichever it was. And that by looking at the way that they walked, that was another thing, that was another indication that these were probably not 2 white men, that these were probably 2 black men. And that was another thing that came up in this. So you had all of these things sort of converge together for law enforcement. They're thinking, this just doesn't make any sense that this would happen at 2 a.m. in the morning on this really cold night. He's saying white men. We're questioning that. They're questioning the whole thing. And even the press, they don't want to say anything, but in the back of their minds, they're going, I don't know if we really believe this. Do you really believe this? We don't really believe this. So that's what's going on in this first episode, giving this sort of breakdown of the very beginning when he is leaving the courtroom, and then the introduction of the brothers and their part, their role that they played in it, how they got into character, what they did coming back, landing back in the United States after their trip to Nigeria, and then getting arrested. So definitely let me know in the comments your thoughts about this, the fact that he's filed this appeal, this docuseries that is out there, and whether or not you believe this was a hoax or that this was somehow something real that happened to Mr. Smollett. So that's pretty much it. Don't forget to give the video a thumbs up if you got a little bit more information about what's going on in this docuseries and with the appeal of Mr. Smollett. And don't forget to subscribe. Mwah. Peace.